Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another biology class. I'm glad you're here. Today, we're going to be looking at organisms and their relationships. So, if you think back to the first lecture of this unit, last class, we asked a question about a bird building a nest in a thorny tree and why it would do that. Well, now we're going to expand that question to ask what are the relationships between that bird and its nest and the thorny tree? What kind of interactions is it going to have because it built its nest there? And that's the main focus question for this section of ecology. So, with that in mind, let's move on to the essential vocabulary. And there's quite a few this time, so I'll read through them real quick just so you can hear them pronounced on their own. And then we'll move into the review vocabulary. So, ecology, biosphere, biotic factor, abiotic factor, limiting factor, tolerance, population, biological community, ecosystem, biome, habitat, niche or niche. I know I pronounce it with a T, there's no actual T, but some people say it as niche, but it's really niche. It's not an English word. Predation or predation. I pronounce it with an extra D. That's not really there, predation, but it's actually predation. So if you hear it said both ways, don't be confused, they're the same word. Symbiosis, mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So I know there's a lot of vocabulary, it can be overwhelming, but don't worry, it's going to be okay. We'll make it together. So species is a word that hopefully in middle school you heard in another science class, but we're going to go ahead and define it again, just in case you haven't, and as a review. So a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce viable offspring. So interbreed means mate to have children, and viable offspring means that the children can also mate with others to have children. It's also a group of organisms with a distinct evolutionary history. That's kind of assumed because they can interbreed, that they would have a very shared relationship in their past. So I don't know why this is necessarily added, but that's fine to add in the definition as well. And I could see maybe being an evil teacher and throwing that second part out as a definition to throw you off in trying to ask what a species is. All right, so organisms. What is an organism? Well, organisms depend on other organisms and non-living things in the environment around them for survival. Okay, and it really is just anything that is alive. Now, a virus isn't really an organism because it's not alive. So you have to have a cell. The smallest organism is going to be a single cell. And ecology is the scientific discipline in which the relationships among living organisms and the interactions with other living organisms have. And it also looks at with their environment and or this is studied by them. So ecology is the study of living organisms and their interactions with other living organisms and their environment would be a good concise way to define ecology. Now, what do ecologists do? What do scientists who study ecology do? Well, they observe, they experiment, and they model using a variety of tools and methods. Mathematics is always involved because good science is always dependent on mathematics to describe reality. Now, that word model, we're not talking like supermodel, we're not talking like Vogue or Vanity Fair or, the K-pop idols. In science, when we're talking about a model, we're talking about a visualization of some kind of system or occurrence or natural phenomena. It's usually based off of mathematical proportionalities, but it can also just be a simple diagram that shows how one thing flows into another. And so that's what we're saying when we say models. Scientists use physical models, mathematical models, and computational or computer models to do a lot of things. When a weatherman is predicting what the weather is going to be like tomorrow, he's using a computer model that's based on mathematical relationships in terms of atmospheric conditions that should or could give rise to some kind of weather pattern, right? So that's a model for predicting the weather in the near future. And so an example of a very simple model, this is hyper simplified, made by my happy AI art assistant, is a water cycle, right? And in the water cycle, you have water as liquid, and it heats and becomes water vapor. And when it gets up to the upper atmosphere, it condenses and then falls back down as rain, okay? And that's a simple cycle. I don't have the arrows in here, but I probably should. But that's an idea of a hyper simplified model of the water cycle. All right, the biosphere. This is an interesting term, and it refers to every place on Earth where you can find something that's alive, right? So the deepest, darkest bottom of the ocean, where things are alive on hydrothermal vents, is part of the biosphere. The clouds, which have been discovered to have little bacteria that sometimes float along with them for the ride, is part of the biosphere. And everything in between, where you can find something alive, the bottom of ice sheets in the Arctic Ocean, deep in caves under Earth, where you have translucent or albino creatures that live in the dark, and of course, out in the open, all of these places are part of the biosphere. Anywhere there's something alive. And the biosphere consists of two types of factors, which are occurrences or conditions. That might be a good way to think of a factor. The first is a biotic factor. And biotic, like bio, means alive, so living factors. And living factors include everything from other plants or insects, mammals, predators, anything that is alive and living in the nearby area is a biotic factor. And so if we look at this picture here, you can see you've got some fungus. That's a biotic factor because fungi are alive. You have trees, you have vines. You could imagine there'd be all kinds of little creepy crawly bugs crawling around. Maybe there'll be some fish in this river going on here. Those are all biotic factors. Now, the river itself, the water, is not alive, so that's not a biotic factor. The air is not alive, and the soil, well, parts of the soil are not alive. We can get into detail on that later, but that's the idea, right? Living things are the biotic factors. And then the abiotic, so A before something oftentimes means not alive or not whatever it is. So theist is someone who believes in a god or gods. An atheist doesn't believe in a god or gods. So putting the capital letter A in front of the word will sometimes change the meaning to the opposite of the word. So in this case, the word was biotic, and putting A in front of it, abiotic, means that it's not living factors, okay? And not living factors is exactly what it sounds like. It's anything that is not alive. So in this picture, you've got some like volcanic lava coming down that's not alive. That's a hot temperature. That's a abiotic factor. So the temperature of the soil, the temperature of the air, whether or not there's water, if the soil is hard rock or loose so that things can grow in it, that's an abiotic factor. Anything that's not alive is an abiotic factor, okay? Now, the last type of factor we're going to talk about in this part of the lecture, and we're going to wrap it up on this slide, is a limiting factor. And the key word or root word you want to think about here is limit. Okay, so a limiting factor is anything in the environment that limits how many of an organism that you can have, right? So if you're thinking about maybe fish in water, well, fish can't live in really, really cold water. And so the temperature is a limiting factor. But I used that example kind of on purpose because this also brings up the idea of a range of tolerance. So fish can live not just in one temperature of water, but in a range of tolerances or a range of temperatures in water. Okay, and so even though temperature is a limiting factor, not all temperatures are limiting factors. And so as you go from an ideal temperature, let's say maybe in the order of 20 degrees Celsius, and you go down towards 0 degrees Celsius, the number of fish that live decreases until it's zero, because somewhere around 5 degrees or 4 degrees Celsius, the fish just all die. And the same thing going up. Maybe you have fish numbers decreasing, going up from 20 to 40 degrees Celsius, and maybe you hit zero around 33 because it's just too hot for the fish to stay alive. It's outside of its range of tolerance. And that's the idea of a limiting factor versus a range of tolerance. A limiting factor means that it impairs the ability of the organism to survive, to stay alive. And a range of tolerance is where it can stay alive, but has an ideal range where it can be the healthiest as alive. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too much for our introductory lecture. Hopefully you learned something. If you have questions, of course, let me know. I love questions. They are, in fact, the very best. And thank you for listening. We'll have one more lecture after you answer a few questions for me. Thank you.